2 Samuel chapter 12. So we're talking about dealing with tragedy and loss in marriage. There are a lot of ways that we may experience tragedy and loss. Our text tonight will make us focus on one particular type of tragedy, and that is the loss of a child. But the things we're going to talk about tonight are not limited in application to just that circumstance. I'm not going to spend any time at all tonight talking about 2 Samuel chapter 11 and the story of David and Bathsheba. I think we're familiar with that story. And clearly we see that there is a direct link between David and Bathsheba's actions in chapter 11 and the loss of the child in chapter 12, okay? It would be very obvious for us to say, well, if David and Bathsheba hadn't been involved in such a scandalous affair, then this whole tragedy could have been avoided. Yes, clearly that's right. But they were involved in a scandalous affair. That doesn't change what they did. And then when they were married, they had to face the loss of this child. So, for our class tonight, I want us to move beyond the sinful actions of these two from chapter 11 and make a broader application. There will be tragedy and loss in some form in your life, and you will experience that together. You will have to deal with some kind of tragedy and loss. Is it possible that your tragedy that you deal with might be directly related to sinful choices that you and or your spouse have made? Yes, that is possible. But it is also very possible, maybe even more likely, that you will deal with tragedy and loss that has nothing to do with sinful choices that either of you have made. We could think of a lot of potential tragedies that we will deal with in life that have nothing to do with sinful behavior or sinful choices. So, loss of a child. There are some of you here tonight who have lived through that. And maybe it was the loss of an adult child. Or maybe it was something like a miscarriage, something that you experienced when you were very young. I suspect that there are all kinds of loss situations. If we went around the room and we say, well, what have you faced? What have you dealt with? We could probably mention a lot of different things. And I hope that you know with tonight's class and as with any other class that we may ever teach, we don't bring up topics like this so that we can open up old wounds that you have let heal. We're not trying to make you hurt again. But these stories are in the Bible. These topics are in Scripture for us to learn from them. And so it's good for us to talk about them. So, David has been told by Nathan, the prophet, in verse 14, the child is going to die. Now, before the child dies, what is David's behavior? What are his actions? What is he described as doing in the chapter before the child dies? He prays. All right? What else? He fasted, that's right. Alan says he acknowledged his sin. Okay, so that happened when he was confronted by Nathan, the prophet. Okay. All right, so he is in this grief-stricken condition, right? So look at chapter 12 and look at verse 16. David therefore inquired of God for the child. He pleaded with God, the New King James says, for the child. David fasted, and he went and lay all night on the ground. He is so distraught over what's happening to this child. I almost said his son. He didn't know it was a son at this point. Later, we find out it was a boy. He's so distraught over the child. No, I'm sorry. I didn't word that right. We don't know, as we're reading, that it was a boy until later. David obviously knew. He's so distraught over the child. He is praying, he's fasting, he is on face down on the ground. And what does it say that his servants in the house, what do you think they're feeling as they're seeing the king like this? They're kind of tiptoeing around, right? They don't want to, you don't want to say something that might not be helpful. You don't want to hurt. You don't want to offend. And yet, at the same time, you want to do something that will be helpful. You want to try to comfort him and be there for him. Have you ever been in that situation before? You don't really know what to say, but you feel like you need to say something. You feel like you want to be there to help comfort and console, but you don't know what to do or say. That's a tough spot to be in. And David's servants are there. Now, verse 17, it says, David would not let the servants lift him up from the ground. I have been around families just through virtue of what I do whose loved ones are dying. And I've seen people who are very upset, very sad, sobbing because of the fact that they're about to lose their loved one. But I have never experienced anything like this. Someone just spread out on the floor, unconsolable. I've never dealt with that. But these servants are trying to help David. They want him to eat. They encourage him to eat. He won't eat anything. He probably is so overcome with emotion, he can't eat, he can't sleep, he can't do anything but cry. Okay. Did you have a comment? Okay, all right, we're gonna come to that, okay? That's a good observation. Now, when David's servants are there and trying to console him, how long does it say this lasted? Yeah, verse 18. It happened on the 7th day that the child died. The 7th day. So for a week, this is what David is doing. And while those servants are wanting to help him, there's nothing they can do. On the 7th day, the child dies, and the servants, verse 19 says, begin whispering, talking to each other. David notices that the servants are whispering, and he knows what's happened. He puts it together. What are the servants worried about if they tell David? This is going to get worse. And they specifically say something at the end of verse 19 that they are really, the end of verse 18, that they are really worried about. He may do himself harm. suicide. David may take his own life, and that's the worst possible situation. But there are other ways that he could potentially do harm to himself, right? And I don't necessarily just mean bodily harm. He might go out and make a really bad decision in a moment of grief, and he may really regret that decision, right? He can do harm to himself in other ways. And the servants are trying to protect him. Now in verse 19, David sees them whispering. The servants confirm, yes, the child is dead. Now, after the child dies, what does David do? He sneezes. I don't know who that was. Gesundheit. Just the timing was impeccable. All right, what does David do after the child dies? Okay. He stops the grieving process, okay? He gets up, he has a bath, he changes his clothes, and he goes to worship. Look at verse, my page turned. Look at verse 20. David arose from the ground, washed, anointed himself, changed his clothes, and he came into the house of the Lord and worshiped. Then he came to his own house, and when he requested, they set food before him, and he ate. He does all of the things that he had not been doing while the child was sick. And the servants find this unusual. Why are you eating and drinking? Why are you going about doing these normal activities now that the child has died? You should have been doing those things while the child was alive, but now that the child is dead, now you should be in mourning and in grief and so forth. They're thinking he's doing this backwards. Now, David's going to go into the explanation as to why he does it in this way, but I do think that there's something worth pointing out here. Do you think people deal with tragedy in different ways? Doesn't this suggest that? David's response to the tragedy is not what others thought it should have been. Does that say that David's response was illegitimate? Was it invalid? No, it was just David's. It was different. So the way people process things may be different. So David responds in a way that's not what was perhaps customarily or socially expected. But that's okay. Because as we think about David's thought process, as he explains why he's behaving the way that he is, it actually makes really good sense, doesn't it? So, let's look at that. His servant said, verse 21, "What is this thing that you have done? While the child was alive, you fasted and wept. But when the child died, you arose and ate food. At a time when you should have been grieving after the child dies, you're up eating and drinking. Why?" And David said, verse 22, "While the child was alive, I fasted and wept. For I said, who knows? The Lord may be gracious to me that the child may live." What was David hoping for while the child was alive? That God might change his mind. That's really what he was hoping for, isn't it? Verse 14, Nathan the prophet said, this is what's going to happen. And then, moreover, it says in verse 15, the Lord struck the child. Nathan said it was going to happen. God made it happen. And now David is praying that it doesn't happen. Perhaps God may be gracious. I feel like David probably knew the odds were very small. But as long as the child lives, there's a chance, right?
He had to take that chance.
Yeah, he's holding out hope that God may change his mind. Joe, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I take it he approached it like a warrior. He was a warrior. He fought all these battles. He fought the battle until it was hopeless. And then he moved on. That's the way
That's interesting. I hadn't thought about that perspective, but yeah, it's a good point. So what David is hoping for is that God will change his mind. But, verse 22, now he has died. Why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? God stated his intention. The child that is born to you will die. Then the child became ill, which is exactly what God said was going to happen. Throughout this whole process, even a process of tragedy, has God still proven himself faithful to his word? Yes. So David realizes, there's nothing I can do about this. This is in the hands of God. God has stated his purpose. It's come to pass. What more is there for me to do? Why should I grieve and mourn anymore? And as he explains that and we read it, we think, okay, that makes sense. And we might think, well, that may not be the way I would have felt about it or the way I would have. Okay, maybe not. But that's how David felt and dealt with it. Wayne?
Well, the thought that I'm having is that David was faithful. David believed God. David knew that God said the child was going to die. And David, for that period of time from when he first knew it until the child died, was grieving. He knew the child was going to die because God said he was going to die. He was grieving during that period of time. After the child died, no use in grieving to the point you made.
Yeah, and let's not think that I'm not saying that David wasn't still upset and wasn't hurting, and of course he was. Of course he was. But he wasn't going through the same actions and processes of grieving and mourning, right? He wasn't doing the fasting anymore, and he wasn't going through some of those same visible outward manifestations. He's not laying in the floor squalling anymore, right? Of course he still is going to feel the pain of this and the hurt of this. I put a thought question on your handout, and I only put this there for you to consider. I don't think there's a right or wrong answer to this. It's an opinion question, okay? David and Bathsheba knew that they would lose their child because Nathan the prophet told David that that would happen. Do you think this information made the tragedy easier or more difficult to face? And explain your answer. Again, I don't have an opinion on this. I really don't know. It was just a good thought exercise for me. What do you think? Do you think it would have been easier to deal with this because you know what's going to happen? Or would that have made it harder to, what do you think, John?
I think it'd be more difficult because they knew why. It enlightened them on they caused the problem.
Okay, and this gets back to the sister's point earlier about the guilt that David would have felt knowing that, he and Bathsheba produced this circumstance. That certainly would have made it more difficult.
More difficult because you know it's going to happen. You can't do anything about it.
You can't do a thing about it. Okay, good. All right.
We know that firsthand because our daughter died of cancer last March.
I'm sorry. God bless you.
We knew it was going to happen.
Yeah, that's difficult. Is this information that you would have wanted? I don't know. I'm not sure about that. Maybe not, right? So Again, I'm not looking for a particular answer. It was a good thing for me to kind of mull around a little bit, and I wanted you to have the opportunity to do that too.
I think they told us the story for a reason.
You think this story is in the scripture for a reason? Is that what you're saying? Yes. Oh, okay. Oh, okay, yes. Okay. Randy?
Have y'all talked about verse 13 where Nathan said, the Lord has put away your sin? Do you think David already talked to God and asked him to heal you for this?
Yeah, we have not talked about that, but yes, that's...
Before Nathan came to him? Because
Oh,
Nathan,
I'm sorry. Had David talked with God already before Nathan came?
asked God to forgive him, because Nathan said, God has already put away your sin.
Yes, right. Okay, that's it. I see your question now. You know, I would struggle to think so because,
God always says, David is a man after my heart.
right.
It mentions, I got a lot of references to this, because he sinned some more after this.
Yeah, absolutely.
And God said, he's a man
Yeah.
after my heart.
Yeah.
Because he always says, forgive me.
Right. So Psalm 51 is the psalm that David wrote after this affair with Bathsheba. And there's no doubt David knew that he was in the wrong. There is something in chapter 12, though, when Nathan confronts David that almost indicates David hadn't really put all this together until Nathan said, you are the man, David. You know, you are that man in that story. And then David says, oh, I have sinned, right?
See, back then, they had to have done something for God to put their sin away. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, I would,
There's no sacrifice.
I see your point. I would,
He said you did it in secret, but now
and yeah, shame you openly and so forth. Yeah. Okay, go ahead.
And something else that I thought of is that he would also have known with Abraham, when Abraham was told to go sacrifice your son, when he got up there, he was stopped at the last minute,
Right.
last second. So he had that hope that perhaps if I allow it, if I go through with it, and I just pray and give it unto him, that maybe he'll change.
Yeah.
Maybe he'll stop at the last moment.
Right. But the interesting thing about that comparison, though, because I thought about that same story, is David is told directly, this is going to happen. Your child's going to die. Right? Abraham, the book of Hebrews talks about how he thought maybe God can raise people from the dead, right? And so he goes through this thinking, I don't know how God's going to work this out, but I believe he's going to, right? Even if I kill my child, God's going to work this out on the other end. And I don't know that there's that same kind of indication with David that he has the same faith in action that Abraham did in that moment, but he certainly has the hope that God will change his mind, right? Yeah. Okay, this is good. All right.
This is a little different, but when my sister passed away, very unexpectedly, it really did worse for my mother because it's out of the sequence of how you think.
Right, yeah.
You don't expect to lose a child,
Right. Yeah.
but then you lose, some age.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting that David was prostrate, he was praying, he was fasting. His servant said, you fasted while he was alive, and you ate afterwards. They forgot. He finished, he worshiped before he came.
Yeah. Yeah.
Doing the same thing that he was doing
Yeah.
as far as honoring God before he
Yeah, that's a great point, and we're gonna come to that in just a moment. Let me give you something else to think about, and I'm not suggesting that I know that this is what was happening in the story. Okay, that's not what I'm suggesting, but I just want us to think about this. 7 days. The child was sick for 7 days. Clearly, God could have said, David, I'm going to strike the child. Boom, child's dead. He could have done it instantly, but he didn't. 7 days. Why? I don't know the answer to that, but let me give you this possibility. I remember as a teenager, my dad saying to me a few times, Ben, if you ever end up in prison, I'm going to let you stay there a few days. And then maybe I'll come get you out. You're going to stay there a few days. Well, Dad, that seems kind of mean. Why don't you come bail me out as soon as you get the phone call? Because I want you to think about why you're in there. 7 days. What do you think David's thinking the entire time he's going through this? This is the lowest point that David has ever been in his life, and he's there for a week. You think that had an impact on David? I would think so. Christine?
Just anticipation, right? Sometimes the anticipation of what is to come is worse.
Just wait till your daddy gets home. Oh, no!
Contrast that with Hezekiah praying and was told, "You shall die." And then before Isaiah leaves, he prays and Isaiah turns around. So the
Yeah.
prayer was answered,
Right.
but it was pretty immediate.
Yeah, Joe?
Well, 2 Samuel 7:16, your kingdom will last forever. He's probably wondering like Abraham, more similar to the parallel.
Okay, yeah, good thoughts. David? Mm-hmm.
Interesting enough, when Isaiah comes back after Hezekiah prays, it says, "You're going to live
15 more years.
He says, "Thus says the Lord God of your father David."
Yeah, that is a great point.
And what Hezekiah would say, "Well, it didn't work out for David.
Yeah.
It's going to work out for me." It's for
Yeah.
the reason God relented at that point.
Right. So let's think about verse 23 and what David says to the servants. I've always thought this was an interesting expression. So David says, "Now he has died. Why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I will go to him, but he will not return to me." Okay, the second expression, "he will not return to me," is obvious. The child's not coming back. This is God's will. He's made this decision. This is it. I will go to him. What does that mean? I'm going to see my boy again. I'm going to see my child again.
All children belong to God.
That's right. I think in this terrible story, there is a bright ray of hope. And even David, in this low point in his life, was still able to see the silver lining. So, let's wrap this up, and let's think about some key concepts. And I put these on the top of your handout every week. The first one, our attitude and our behavior must be in a Godward direction throughout tragedy and loss, or it's worded something like that. I'm sure I didn't get the order right. But our attitude and our behavior in times of tragedy must be in a Godward direction. Do you see that in David in this story? Life is as bad as it can possibly be right now, and yet he's praying, he's fasting, he worships God. Everything David is doing has a Godward direction. He doesn't let tragedy turn him away from God or shake his faith in God. But instead, he leans into it, and he uses that to get him through the tragedy. The second concept, hope and strong faith are essential. Now, these two ideas go together, right? They clearly go together, but they're a little different. How do you see hope illustrated in David as he's going through the tragedy? We just talked about verse 23. I will go to him. There is an eternity for me with him. Okay? There's hope there. I think it's interesting. I'm not sure what to make of it, but it's interesting that Bathsheba's emotions, actions, are not recorded. I don't know why that is. I do know verse 24 says that David comforted his wife. She was clearly hurting. She was having a hard time with this too. Obviously she was. And she needed consolation. And David was there for her. And I think that's something that we need to emphasize. The title of the lesson is Dealing with Tragedy and Loss Together. They're going through this together. But there's another element of hope in the story. David comforted his wife Bathsheba, and what does it go on to say next? They had another child. Solomon was born. And so while they lose the one that came from their affair, God doesn't just cast them away and say, oh, how could you do all these terrible things? You're despicable people. He blesses them with another child. Not just any child, but the next king. Yeah, the next king of Israel. And in the lineage of Christ, that's right. There are multiple elements of hope and faith in this story. Even though the story started off with scandal on the previous page. So, final point to make from that. Can God redeem sinful, scandalous things and make blessings out of them? Yes. Isn't the Bible full of stories where God does exactly that? All right. Thank you, everyone. I don't remember where we're going next week. Ahab and Jezebel. That's where we're going. Next week's the singing. That's right, because it's Turkey Day singing. Yes. Okay, so then the following, we'll be doing Ahab and Jezebel. All right. Thank you much.